Well, I had to make this joke last week, and I'm going to have to again today. We announced Adopt a Family is coming soon and that there would be information, and we'd let you know. Well, the information is that it's in the lobby right now. So, we do announcement videos on like a 2-week rotation, and when I write the scripts for those, when I wrote the script a couple weeks ago, we didn't have information. And then I found out about 30 minutes after we shot the 2 weeks of announcement videos that we had all the information and it was going to be set up. So here we are. It is there. It is out there. Those Christmas trees, those wooden Christmas trees in the lobby are the Adopt a Family display. And so after service, if you want to be a part of Adopt a Family, head out there, browse through those ornaments, pick out whatever you'd like. When you do that, though, there's just one request, and that's that you would see there will be a team member, an outreach team member standing there with a clipboard. Make sure you see them so that they can record what gifts you got. That's for our own internal purposes. I also want to mention that we adopted more families this year than we ever have before, and there are a ton of ornaments on those trees. Now, last week I told you all that we as a church had decided to buy one of the families a refrigerator because they said that they needed a refrigerator, and so we just went ahead and took care of that. I'm not sure if it's all done yet, but if it's not, it's happening. Regardless, I also wanted to let you know that the number of ornaments out there is astronomically high, and there's a very real possibility that there will be a bunch of ornaments left on those trees. I don't want you all to feel like, oh no, what are we gonna do? Because we have a plan. We're just gonna buy whatever doesn't get taken. So I said last week, we were able to buy that refrigerator for that family because you guys have been so generous over the last couple of years, and we're in a position to be able to do that. And so thank you for that generosity. But beyond just buying the refrigerator, we are also going to cover whatever gifts are left. The church is going to purchase and make sure those families get all of those gifts this year. So you may not see those gifts in terms of, you might look at those trees and go, oh no, there's a lot left over. But I want you to know that those families are going to receive those gifts, and it is because of your generosity that we're able to do that. So thank you very much. Thank you. It is awesome this year to be able to do that. All that said, today we are jumping into part 20 of the story. Now, if you're new, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, I'll get you caught up real quick. We're in the midst of a journey as a church family through the Bible in 31 parts. I've never done anything like this. I typically preach in shorter sermon series, and so this is a little bit different. But we're in the middle of going through the Bible in 31 weeks, and we're doing that with the aid of a book called The Story. I didn't bring my copy up here today, but there's a book called The Story, and that book, if you're not familiar with it, takes the Bible and it condenses it quite a bit, and puts it in chronological order. And the benefit of that is that it helps make a bit more obvious the one big story the Bible is telling. Because as you read through the Bible, you don't always see the one big story, but the Bible is telling one big story, and that one big story is the most important story. And so the story book aims to kind of solve that problem a bit by putting the Bible into chronological order, condensing it a bit, making it a bit easier to digest so it reads more like a novel. If you're interested, if you don't have the storybook, we're 20 weeks into this, but that's okay. We've still got 11 more to go, and the story, it's an incredible book anyway. We do have copies of that available back at the Next Steps area for $5. So if you want to pick that up, you are more than welcome to do that after service is over. Today we are in part 20, and we've been breaking up this big series into kind of sub-series. This series is called A Nation in Exile because that's where we are in the story. And so to get everybody caught up again, and if you've been around, I know you're probably like, man, stupid timeline again, that's fine. You don't have to pay attention for this part. Tune back in a moment. But if you're not, let me get you caught up on where we are in the story. So we've covered creation, the fall, the flood. That was chapter 1. We started there. We've walked all the way through Abraham, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, down the line. We are now somewhere around 450 BC, most likely. We don't know the exact date, but we're somewhere around 450 BC. And so what I want you to understand here is that this one big story the Bible is telling is that in the beginning, God created people for relationship with him. That was his goal. He wanted relationship with humans, and then we messed it up. And when we messed it up, God began a rescue plan. And basically everything from Abraham through that kind of greenish section. Is that green? I've realized that I struggle with colors sometimes. Is that green? I should not have opened the floor for that. That color, whatever it is, all the way through there is kind of this second act of the story. It's God implementing his rescue plan. And what God's rescue plan looks like is he says to Abraham early on, he says, hey, I'm gonna bless you. I'm gonna make your name great. I'm gonna bless you immensely so that you can be a blessing to the world. And ultimately what God is trying to do through Abraham and his family is have a group of people who demonstrate who God is to the world so people will come back to him. But Abraham and his family are not good at this. And so the entire rest from Abraham all the way through where we are now is sort of this, I like to think of it like it's this case study into human nature. It's like all the ways that we get things wrong with our relationship with God over and over and over and over and over. God calls Israel back to him and then they mess up, and then he calls them back and then they mess up. And it's just this cycle that over time kind of gets worse and worse and worse until eventually God's like, oh man, these people just, they don't get it. And so I've got to take on some drastic measures in order to like get their attention. And so this thing happens where the nation of Israel is conquered by surrounding nations, and all at once this promise that God had made that his people would have their own land, it goes away. They would have a place to call their own, and it's gone. And Israel is exiled to a surrounding nation, at first Babylon and eventually to Persia. And while that's happening, the last series we did was kind of it was funny because I talked with several of you who were walking through the story journey and were like, this part of the Bible's terrible. Like, yeah, kind of. Because it's depressing. There's nothing good happening. Everything's bad. And like it gets progressively worse. There's all kinds of ugliness. And it's this period of time where it's like there's clearly no hope. Nobody's ever going to get it right. But then once Israel is finally exiled, some things start to change. And it's within that God starts to do a few really, really, really important things. In fact, I would say there are three very important things that God clearly is doing, and we see these themes throughout the different stories in this portion of the story. Number one, this isn't in your notes or anything, but number one is that there start to be these prophecies of a coming king. This is new. There had been many prophecies in Israel's history, but they hadn't been about like a future conquering king. So there begin to be these prophecies about a conquering king. Now, we know the end of the story, and so the end of the story is Jesus, right? We know that, but the Israelites at the time did not. So there begin to be prophecies of a coming king, and this pointing forward to like, God's not done with Israel yet. Another major thing that begins to emerge through this section of the story is that God is beginning to restore people back to Israel from exile. And so we covered that, I believe it was just last week, we covered how God had sent a group back to begin rebuilding the temple. And at this point, the temple has been rebuilt. And that was a huge moment for the nation of Israel. The temple was a source of identity and a source of pride. And it had been destroyed and burned in the Babylonian invasion. And so the fact that at this point, the people of Israel had been given permission to go home and rebuild the temple is enormous and demonstrated that God was not done with Israel yet. And within all of that, there's this major theme that emerges in this section, that God hasn't changed. That God is exactly the same as he was way back at the very beginning of the story, all the way through the story. His character, his qualities, his behavior, the ways that he loves his people hasn't changed one bit. And there's this very clear, there are these very clear moments kind of in this section of the story where it's almost like the whole purpose of this portion of the story is to say, look, I am who I have always said I would be. And so although your circumstances are totally different than you ever imagined, although it might look hopeless, I'm still with you and my promises still remain. And this happens in a variety of different ways. And today's chapter 20, is actually one of the big reasons why I think this is a central theme of this section. So as we get to chapter 20, this chapter is the entire book of Esther in the Bible. So the book of Esther is a fairly short chapter, and so they just stuck it into one chapter in the storybook. And the book of Esther is a really interesting book for a couple of reasons. The biggest of which is that it doesn't mention God one time. None. Doesn't talk about God, which seems odd for a biblical book, but it doesn't. Doesn't mention God once. Now, a little bit of background on the story of Esther, the book of Esther. The timeline, this is most likely about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. So at this point, the temple has been rebuilt. The Babylonians had actually been conquered by the Persians, and so the Israelites now are exiled mostly in the Persian Empire. And at this point in time, the location of this book is in the Persian capital city of Susa, while a man named Xerxes is king. Now, Xerxes was at the time the most powerful king on earth, the most powerful ruler on earth. And so as you might imagine, he liked his power. And that comes into play significantly throughout the book of Esther. In fact, as the book begins, we find out that King Xerxes was having this big festival, this big feast. And toward the end of it, it was many, many days long. And toward the end of it, he ordered the queen to come to the feast and to show off how beautiful she was to all the people who were in attendance. The queen did not like this order, and so she decided she wasn't going to do it. And this is the first time in the story that Xerxes just decides that he's going to do something drastic. And so the Bible's a little bit unclear as to whether he just banished Vashti or if he killed Vashti. But either way, he did away with his wife, with the queen of Persia. And at that point, he gets a harebrained idea. He decides he's going to hold a beauty contest. And all the young women in the kingdom are going to be ordered to come, and he's just going to go one by one, and he's going to pick somebody. And so that's when we're introduced to our second and third main characters in the book of Esther. A man named Mordecai, who is a Jew, a Jewish man, who has adopted his niece, a woman named Hadassah, or Esther. Esther, as it turns out, is gorgeous, and she wins the beauty contest. And this young woman who has no father and mother, which in that particular culture would have been essentially a death sentence. There was no future, no hope for someone without a mother and a father. All of a sudden is elevated to the position of queen of Persia out of nowhere. And there's kind of this whole series of events that happens. Right after Esther is elevated to this position, Mordecai actually happens to be out by the city gates, and he overhears these couple guards talking about an assassination attempt that's going to happen on Xerxes. So Mordecai sends word to Esther because she's in the palace. And Esther goes to Xerxes and tells him about it, and they thwart the plot, and all at once Mordecai now is a national hero. And it's kind of this situation where, it's a little too coincidental to be coincidental, right? There's too many good things happening for it to just be happenstance. And so as we enter into the book of Esther, into chapter 20 of the story, again, that does not mention God even one time, I think a lot of what's happening here is it's inviting us to reflect on how do we interpret and understand the events in our lives that do not clearly have a direct correlation with God's action. Because we encounter that all the time. We constantly are encountering situations and circumstances in our lives that, we don't know that it was God that was orchestrating them. We don't know that it was God that was doing it. And so we're left to sort of interpret that. And at this point, Esther and Mordecai, I would think, are kind of left to go, well, it seems like God's doing some good things, but I don't know for sure. Well, as the story progresses, things get a little bit more interesting because eventually there's another main character, the fourth and final main character of the book of Esther. A man named Haman enters the scene. Now, Haman rises up through the ranks in Xerxes' kingdom and becomes Xerxes' right-hand man, second in command in all of Persia. And Haman, when he becomes second in command, gets a little power drunk. The way the Bible tells it is that all of a sudden people all around the kingdom will bow down in front of Haman when he walks by because he's powerful. But there's one man who won't bow before Haman, and that's Mordecai. Now, Mordecai, it's interesting too, because again, for those of you that have been on this journey, this reminds me a bit of the book of Daniel and one of the stories in the book of Daniel. The Bible doesn't explicitly say, but it appears to me that Mordecai doesn't bow because Mordecai takes the position of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who say, we're not going to bow to anyone except for our God. We're not going to bow to a man. And so Mordecai is firm in his faith and doesn't bow, and it enrages Haman. So Haman goes to King Xerxes, and he's like, hey, king, listen, there's this group of people in our kingdom that are a problem. You might have encountered them, some king. They aren't like us. They're different. They have different customs. They have a different God. And they don't obey you. So if you don't do something about them, they're probably going to end up causing chaos in the kingdom. So you should kill them all. And King Xerxes is like, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I'm the king. I'm going to kill them. So they issue a decree. They roll a die to decide what day, and the king issues a decree that on this particular day, all of the Jews in the kingdom of Persia are to be killed, all of the Israelites. Now, this presents a problem, obviously, for Mordecai and for Esther. Esther, to this point, has hidden her identity. The king does not know that she is an Israelite. He doesn't know that she's a Jew. And so Mordecai is torn up about this. He's devastated. For Mordecai, this feels like just another turn down this road of like, God made us all these promises, and here we are, and we're about to be wiped from the face of the earth. And so he sends a letter to Esther. And he says, Esther, you have to go to the king, and you have to reveal to the king who you are and ask him to reverse the decree. And Esther sends word back and says, well, Mordecai, you know that the laws of the kingdom are that if anybody approaches the king without being asked, they'll be killed. And like, he just got rid of Vashti. So, I mean, we're not talking about there's not precedent here. So she sends word back to Mordecai, and when Mordecai receives the news, he's upset. He's disappointed for a moment. But then Mordecai decides, no, I'm gonna think this through, and I'm gonna give a good response. And there's this very brief section in the middle of the book of Esther that serves as a pivot point for the entire story. And that pivot point comes as Mordecai responds to Esther, and then Esther responds back to Mordecai. It's a really, really powerful couple of paragraphs. So rather than tell you about them, I want to read these. This is from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. When Esther's words, when she told Mordecai that she wasn't going to be able to go to the king, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family, you'll perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Now pause before I read Esther's response. This is an incredibly powerful moment. I don't want to gloss past it, because what Mordecai is doing here is demonstrating exactly the thing that God has always been asking from his people, always. And again, this reminds me in some significant ways of the stories in the book of Daniel and in other places. It reminds me specifically of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they go before the king and they say to the king Nebuchadnezzar at the time, we're not going to bow to you, and our God will deliver us from the fire, but even if he doesn't, we won't bow. See, Mordecai seems to have this understanding that no matter what comes, God is faithful, right? He says, if you don't do this thing, he doesn't say God, he doesn't. But if you've been tracing along, it's too coincidental to be coincidental. Mordecai is thinking the Lord is going to deliver us. I think you're the instrument. I think God has positioned you right where he's positioned you for exactly this moment so that you can be an instrument of deliverance for him. But if you won't rise up and take on that mantle, he will find another way. And that confidence, that assuredness in who God is exactly the thing that God has always been asking his people to have. And it's clearly inspiring to Esther because her response, again, reminds me of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and demonstrates the courage that she has. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. In other words, go to the Lord. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. They are demonstrating their dependence on God for the task at hand. And then what Esther says is, when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. It's an incredible moment. It's an incredible moment because, again, all God has ever asked of his people is to trust him. And for those of you who've been around for a while, maybe you're getting sick of me saying that. I apologize. I'm not going to stop saying it. And in fact, in a couple weeks when we start Christmas at the movies, there's a whole movie around it. So, like, it's more's coming. But But this is the thing. And if you read the story from the beginning until now, you see it time and time again. God has said, trust me, trust me, trust me. Listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. Obey me, because I know what I'm doing. So just do what I ask you to do. Trust me. And here it is again that although the story doesn't mention God, we see these same kind of like people are wrestling with what do we do? How do we approach this? And we see that Esther's plan is to go to God, to fast, to pray, to seek the Lord. And then she says, okay, once we've done the first thing, the only thing that matters first, once we go to God, then I'll go to the king, and whatever comes my way comes my way. My future is in God's hands. And so Esther does exactly that. It's an incredible moment. Again, it's like a hinge point for this whole book, because up to this point in time, there's been this, like Haman's out to get Mordecai, and Mordecai doesn't have any power. He's been hailed as a national hero, but he doesn't have any power. And Esther's the queen, but she doesn't really have any power either. And Xerxes is now out to get the Jews, and not really, because it's really Haman's plan, but Xerxes is going along with it. And there's things still don't look great. But it's at this moment that things start to change. Because Esther goes to Xerxes, and she sets up a banquet, and she invites Xerxes and Haman to the banquet. They sit down and they eat, and Xerxes is like, hey, why'd you set up this feast? What do you want? Anything you want, I'll give it to you. And Esther says, well, I tell you what, why don't we actually have another banquet tomorrow? Let's have another banquet tomorrow, and at that banquet, I will tell you what I want. I want you and Haman to come back. King's like, fine. So they leave, and at this point, they're both, Haman and Xerxes are both drunk, and as Haman leaves, he runs by Mordecai on the road home, and he becomes enraged, just enraged. And so he sends word to his servants and says, I want you to take a giant pole and sharpen it into a point, because I'm going to impale Mordecai on it tomorrow. By the way, if impaling is a big deal in the book of Esther, apparently the Persians liked it a lot. And so he says, I'm going to impale Mordecai on it tomorrow morning. So the next morning comes, and Haman goes to the king to request permission to impale Mordecai. But what Haman doesn't know is that in the nighttime, the king couldn't sleep. And he had requested that the chronicles of the kingdom be read to him, for like some light bedtime reading. And so as this is happening, he is reminded, the story of Mordecai saving his life is read to him. He's reminded of how heroic Mordecai was, and he wakes up the next morning determined to honor Mordecai. And so when Haman comes in, he's like, King, I need to talk to you about something. And Xerxes is like, no, I got something first. You know that guy Mordecai? Yeah. That guy Mordecai. I want you to go take him, put him on a horse, ride him through the city, lead him through the city, and I want you to order everyone who sees him to bow down and worship him, because we're so grateful for him saving my life. And Haman's like, ugh. But he does it, because you can't disobey the king. But the pivot doesn't stop there, because later that day they assemble for the feast, and Xerxes again says, Esther, my queen, what is it that you want? What is it that you've requested our presence for? And Esther lays everything out. And she says, King, I'm a Jew, I'm an Israelite. And there's someone in your kingdom that's out to get me and my people and wants to kill us all. And somehow or another, apparently Xerxes doesn't remember this. It appears through the book of Esther that Xerxes really liked alcohol, and that maybe he wasn't aware of what was happening a lot. That's the only thing that I can come. But he doesn't remember. He says, he looks at Esther, he says, who would dare do such a thing? And Esther says, Haman. Xerxes is furious. And he goes outside to take a moment, and when he comes back in, he says, all right, I'm going to kill him. And so, again, an ironic twist. One of the guards says, well, Haman just had us make a giant spike in his yard. We can use that. The king's like, yep. So they impale Haman on the pole that he built to impale Mordecai. I've said before, and I'll just keep saying that, man, if somebody took the Bible and made a legit movie out of it, it would be something. Like the biggest epics, just crazy stuff. So Haman is killed. And it's at this point in time that the king begins to elevate Mordecai, because he was heroic. In fact, things come to a head when They're trying to figure out, what do we do about this edict that you've issued? Because in Persian culture, the king couldn't undo an edict. And so even though the king had recognized that Haman was just trying to mess things up, he couldn't undo the decree he had issued to kill the Jews. And so they all get together and they're like, what do? We got to solve this problem. And they come up with an idea that on the day that the decree has been issued for, they're going to issue another decree that says that all the Jews must defend themselves and kill those who are trying to kill them. Like, all right, just issue a decree that will order them to defend themselves. And so they do it, and the king is super pleased with Mordecai for all of it. And then we see this moment in Esther chapter 8. It says, when Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing garments, royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province, in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebration. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. Now, that little aside, we could spend some time there, but we're not going to right now. What I want you to notice here is that God has done something incredible. God has demonstrated his ability once again to move and work within the hearts of kings and kingdoms who don't know him, who don't fear him, who don't respect him, who don't worship him. He has demonstrated that he will care for his people and that he will do whatever he must to provide for, protect, and deliver his people. And it's just one more in a sequence of story after story after story where God uses all these crazy circumstances to arrange situations to provide for his people, to deliver his people, to protect his people. And in this case, again, he chooses to use people who were in exile, who were not royalty, who were not anything special particularly. They just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and God used them to do powerful things. So Mordecai is elevated to the position that Haman held in the kingdom. He becomes the king's second in command. And when the day comes where the Jews were supposed to be annihilated, they are rescued. They are delivered. And at that point in time, Esther and Mordecai and the leaders of the Jews decide to implement a new holiday that they call Purim, which is actually still celebrated by Jews to this day. A 2-day festival where they remember the deliverance of the Lord through Queen Esther and her uncle Mordecai. The book finishes with a brief epilogue telling of Mordecai's royal greatness and how the Jews were thriving in their exile to Babylon. So what's the point? Like, why does this book exist? How does this book fit inside the larger story? Well, as we've talked about throughout this, there really are two stories happening in parallel in the Bible. There's the lower story, which is the story that you and I live out every day. And then there's this upper story, where clearly, in certain moments, in huge ways and sometimes in small ways, it is so obvious that God is doing things that humans don't have the capacity, the ability to even possibly understand. And so while we're moving about our day-to-day lives, assuming that the circumstances we see, we're interpreting through the right lenses, the reality is God is often up to something completely different that we can't possibly see. And I think the book of Esther is just another example of this difference between the upper story and the lower story, about how when things are happening in the lower story, we just don't always understand what those things are. And frankly, I think the book of Esther is just one more in this same theme. And maybe it sounds like a broken record at this point, but if any of you if you've had kids, you know that sometimes, when you say a thing to your kid, it's like you didn't say a thing at all. You know, like, I may as well have just talked to the wall. Sometimes, all the time, sometimes when you say things to your kid 12 times, you may as well have said it to a wall. All the time. Just yesterday, I had a bunch of work to do yesterday, which is unusual on a Saturday, but I had a bunch of work to do, and Vanessa was trying to get the kids to clean the house, and it was chaos in our home, let me just tell you, like utter chaos. And I don't know how many times I heard her repeat the same things over and over and over. If she would have been talking to any inanimate any inanimate object in the house, it would have been more successful than talking to our children. And some of the instructions she was giving were instructions we have given them for the entirety of their lives. Brooklyn is 11 years old and still doesn't know the things we've been telling her for 11 years, right? You understand this dynamic, yes? Okay, so sometimes God has to do the same with us. Sometimes God has to tell us things 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, 100 times, because we don't learn. Now, you're all smart people. You are much smarter than I am, so you probably learn faster than I do. But I cannot tell you the number of times in my life that I've had circumstances and situations happen, and on the back end, as I've tried to process through it with the Lord, he's been like, hey, remember that thing I've been telling you your whole life? That thing. Hey, remember how I've never let you down? Maybe stop thinking that I'm gonna let you down. Hey, remember how I've just said over and over, trust me, man, because I've got this. Remember how you just like to keep grabbing control of things and don't trust me? Would you knock it off? Yeah, okay, God, I got it. See, this portion of the Bible, while Israel is in exile, we see these same things repeated over and over and over and over, because Israel is just like you, they're just like me. They're like what Moses described thousands of years before at this point. They're stiff-necked people. They don't learn. I don't learn. You learn better than me, so I'm not insulting you. I'm only insulting me. But we don't learn. And because we don't learn, it's like God has to show us over and over again, you're gonna mess it up, you're gonna mess it up, you're gonna mess it up, now that it's as bad as it can be, let me show you, I'm with 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 you. And he just keeps telling, it's like he's just beating a drum. But as a dad, I get it, because I gotta beat those drums too, a lot. And so we see this, what's the point of the book of Esther? It's just one more in this line of, look, when circumstances are a mess, God is working. God is moving. When you're in a location that you never imagined, God is working. God is moving. When you find yourself surrounded by circumstances that are like, how is this ever going to work out for my good? God is working and God is moving. When you're exiled, God is working. God is moving. And critically, I think there's another thing we need to see here. It's because, I think, of the trust that Mordecai and Esther demonstrate in the Lord through the passage that we initially read. It's clear that they trust God. And I believe that it is through that trust that they have been, and listen, I gotta be honest, I'm reading between the lines when I say this, okay? I'm reading between the lines. But I think that that's one of the things that you're supposed to do in a sense in the Bible. You're supposed to read these things and go, I wonder why these people did this. And then you're supposed to reflect on other parts of the story and connect some dots. And it's hard, it's challenging, but it's one of the beautiful things because it means the Bible never gets old. And so as I was reading this, I got to thinking about our own journey through the story. And I remembered a passage that I read to you guys a few weeks back from the book of Jeremiah. See, when Israel was first exiled to Babylon, it seemed like all hope was gone. But God gave Israel some very specific instructions about how he wanted them to live while they were in exile. And they were instructions that probably to somebody who had just watched their capital city be burned and destroyed would have been like, really? You want us to do what? My suspicion is that Mordecai and Esther chose to live this way because they remembered it and they trusted God enough to be obedient. And it was because of that obedience that the Lord opened doors and put them in positions to save his people. These were the instructions God gave Israel when they were taken into captivity. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Man, that sounds like Eden. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Who tells exiles that? That's insane. But those are the instructions God gave to Israel. And what we see in Esther and Mordecai, I think, is a demonstration of living this way, living unusually, seeking the peace and prosperity. When Mordecai heard about the plot against the king, he could have been like, that king deserves it. We shouldn't even be here. But he didn't. Esther could have ignored the edict and not gone to be the queen of this king who had exiled her people. I believe they chose to live exactly this way in line with what God said. They sought the peace and prosperity of the city. They sought its good. They tried to benefit it. And as a result, God moved in an incredible way in their lives. And I think ultimately, again, it's beating a dead horse. Like I'm coming up with different ways. I'm having a hard time coming up with new ways to say the same things. But I think this story, the book of Esther, chapter 20, is a reminder that God is working everything out when nothing is working out. He's just always working stuff out. And when it seems like nothing is working out, that's okay, God's working it out. When legitimately nothing is working out, it's okay, God's got it. When everything in life is hectic and haywire and not the way it's supposed to be, God is working it out. And he never stops. And it is, again, one more example, story after story after story after story, of God demonstrating to his people how he can move and work and do things. Esther and Mordecai had no ability to save the nation of Israel. None. It was only through the power and providence of the Lord and the obedience of his people that a door was opened for them to be able to be instruments for God's use. It was the Lord that did all of it. The book of Esther never mentions him one time, but it's all a little too coincidental to be coincidental. You know what I mean? And so we're left to grapple with this question. What do we do when we find ourselves in situations that are not the situations we think we should be in? When nothing is working out, when nothing is going according to plan, when nothing is the way we imagined it, when everything is stacked against us, what do? We keep trusting the Lord. We just keep trusting him. We just keep trusting him. We just keep trusting him. Well, okay, but don't we do more things? Nope. We pray, we fast, we seek the Lord, and we wait on his deliverance. Because he never failed Israel for all those years. At this point in the story, we can see he's still not failing them. He is still exactly who he said he was. He never failed them after. And I don't know about you, but when I look at my life, all those knuckleheaded times where I ignored God and took things into my own hand and all that stuff, he never failed me either. And so I think that's what the book of Esther is about. I think that's what chapter 20 of the story is about. It is one more reminder in a very long string of reminders that when you're a knuckleheaded kid and your parent keeps repeating the same thing over to you and you're like, would you shut up? I already know. And God's like, no, I'm not going to keep shutting up because you need to know that I'm with you, that I'm for you, that I love you, that I will deliver you, that I will protect you, that I will provide for you. I've always done it. Would you stop forgetting? Because I'm still here. I'm still on the throne. And I am still your God. Let me pray for us today. Father, thank you.